not speaking to the media.
Tonight?
Tonight.
She's not speaking to the media tonight?
She has said she is unavailable for media. She will make a statement, but not take questions.
I did not know that.
The commissioner of the WNBA just walked into a press conference, released a written statement, and then refused to take a single question from the media. Not one. A written piece of paper handed out, and then complete radio silence while reporters sat there with their hands raised. In any major professional sports league, that moment would be the lead story on every sports network for the next 72 hours. Imagine Adam Silver doing that during a LeBron James controversy. Imagine Roger Goodell releasing a statement about a player safety issue, and then walking out without acknowledging a single journalist in the room. It would be a catastrophe. The media would be relentless. The accountability would be immediate and fierce. But in the WNBA, when Kathy Engelbert did exactly that, it barely registered outside of dedicated fans and analysts paying close attention. And that gap between how it was covered and how significant it actually is tells you something important about where this league stands and how much danger it's actually in. Because what Engelbert communicated by refusing to take questions wasn't just bad optics. It was a full organizational confession. She doesn't have answers. She doesn't have
organizational leadership right now. Just to keep my brain. This is perfect timing. When you don't set the tone at the top with ethics, with values, with your leadership, then as in Christie's statement comes, you can let people run amok. Mm-hmm. So Kathy does not have a relationship where she can pick up the phone, should have picked up the phone, whether it's AT now or somebody else back then, and said, hey, what's going on? How can we help you? Mm-hmm. That is not happening. That's why you get the comments from Nafisa Collier last year. Mm-hmm. So you have to set the tone with.
She doesn't have solutions. She doesn't have the relationships with her players or the clarity of her values to defend her decisions in real time. And the WNBA is now paying the price for that in ways that are going to take years to fully understand. Let's start with what that press conference moment actually tells us about the state of the WNBA's organizational leadership, because this is where everything else flows from. When a commissioner of a professional sports league faces a significant controversy and responds by releasing a written statement followed by complete refusal to engage with questions, they're not being strategic. They're being cowardly. They're telling the world that the situation has grown beyond their ability to manage in real time. They're admitting, without saying a word, that they don't have defensible answers to the questions they know will be asked. Think about what Engelbert was almost certainly trying to avoid by taking that approach. She would have been asked directly about the death threats that Alyssa Thomas received after her physical confrontation with Caitlin Clark. She would have been asked why the league's discipline was what it was. She would have been asked about the pattern of physical play targeting Clark that's been visible throughout the season. She would have been asked about the racial dynamics that are impossible to ignore when you look at how different fans responded to different physical incidents involving different players. She would have been asked about the officiating failures that every coach in the league has been complaining about regardless of whether their team is winning or losing. Those are hard questions. Those are questions that don't have clean, politically safe answers. And a commissioner who's built a career on navigating organizational challenges,
make sure that people buy into that. But if you don't have a relationship with the people that you work with, it's kind of hard because they don't know if there is anything to buy into. Right. So it starts at the top and it trickles down. And what we're seeing is a lack of leadership, a lack of, from the outside, I will say, looks like a lack of empathy, a lack of caring, and a lack of structure where there are consequences for the people that do these things. Now, you cannot police social media. I'm not saying that.
Yeah.
But you can have
unfortunately.
You can have a stronger stance. You can find ways to communicate that strong stance on a consistent basis. What Kathy has done is she's just put people in an impossible situation. Yeah. Stephanie White is in an impossible situation. Mm-hmm. She's damned if she do and damned if she don't, because obviously she's going to have to, take up for Caitlin Clark, whether she can defend or not.
Apparently decided that none of those questions had answers worth defending publicly. So the statement went out, the silence fell, and every person with a difficult question was left standing there without a response. The organizational leadership expert Helen, whose analysis is featured in the conversation around this, breaks it down perfectly. When you don't set the tone at the top with ethics, with values, with genuine leadership, you let people run amok. That's not commentary. That's a precise diagnosis of exactly what's happening in the WNBA right now. The chaos we're watching, the fan toxicity, the player targeting, the coach frustration, the media narrative warfare, all of it flows downstream from a leadership structure that never established clear ethical standards and never built the relationships necessary to enforce them when things got difficult. Helen specifically makes the point that Engelbert doesn't have the kind of relationship with her players where she can pick up the phone and have a real conversation. That's not speculation. That's observable. We saw it last year with the Derica Hamby situation, where a player's personal circumstances became a public controversy, and the commissioner's office appeared.
And Caitlin to work out, hey, Caitlin, you need to do better. You need to be a better leader, blah, 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 blah. But she's in an impossible situation because people don't like the fact that she defends her, but then the other people don't like the fact if she didn't defend her. This honestly has nothing to do with basketball. This just happens to be the arena in which this behavior is happening.
Wowza. That's a word right there, Helen, for sure. Because I know, Cindy, you just said that, Kathy Engelbert's not going to take questions, but if she has a statement tonight, I hope, wish, and pray that it has something to do with what has happened with Alyssa Thomas in this situation and getting death threats. I hope, wish, and pray that that is addressed. And like you said, the ethics piece, Helen, that
you're disconnected from what was actually happening with the people in the league. We're seeing it now with how the Clark incidents are being handled. There's a fundamental gap between the league office and the actual human beings playing the game. That gap is the product of years of leadership that prioritized organizational messaging over genuine player relationships. What proper leadership looks like in this situation is actually not that complicated. It's showing up. It's getting on a plane to Vegas when the game is in Vegas. It's standing in front of the media and saying, here is what happened. Here is what we're doing about it. Here are the standards we hold this league to. It's picking up the phone when a player is in a difficult situation and asking how the league can help. None of those things are administratively complex. They all require something much harder. The willingness to be present, to be accountable, and to actually defend your decisions and your values in real time. Engelbert's refusal to take questions didn't protect her from criticism. It amplified it. Because a written statement, by itself, says nothing about whether the person who wrote it actually...
That needs to be what this league has stood on for 30 years, right? The love of the game being the star and the way things are being handled. And you can't police social media. And to your point, that's just, and I wish you could. I mean, you could block people. I mean, and just mute and block, restrict all the things that you can do on social media. I've done, and I can do that too, to this, if people have something to say about what I'm saying on here, period. I don't care. I just love the game so much for what it stands for, right? And this would be such a missed opportunity to address the further growth of the ethics of the WNBA and what the WNBA has stood for, the inclusivity, the everyone standing together, like we saw that in the bubble, just the unified love that everyone presents for this game. And to have anyone come in from the outside trying to ruin that needs to be stopped. And that's what I hope, wish, and pray happens in that presser with no questions coming in, but you have a statement to make. And I hope that's part of the statement, because there are too many people out here with blood, sweat, and tears and shoulders that this league has been built on for 30 years. And some that didn't even play in the league, love the league the same way as people who actually got the
believes in it or is capable of defending it. It's a press release. It's words on paper. It tells you what the communications team decided to say, not what the leader actually thinks or how she plans to actually solve the problem. And in a moment this significant, that's not enough. That gap between what the statement says and what the leader is willing to defend in person is exactly where organizational credibility goes to die. Here's something that gets lost in the conversation about Engelbert's leadership failures. The commissioner's absence from accountability doesn't just affect the league's public image. It directly damages the people within the organization who are trying to do their jobs. Specifically, it puts Indiana Fever head coach Stephanie White in one of the most untenable positions any coach in professional sports has had to navigate in recent memory. Think about what White is dealing with on a daily basis. Her franchise player, Caitlin Clark, is being physically targeted in ways that sometimes cross the line from aggressive basketball into genuine cheap shot territory. The officiating is inconsistent in ways that sometimes protect Clark, and sometimes leave her completely exposed depending on who's calling the game, and what kind of night they're having. The fan base is divided between people who think Clark isn't being protected enough, and people who think she's already getting too much preferential treatment. The media has competing narratives about what's actually happening on the court. And the league office, instead of providing clear standards and guidelines for how coaches should handle these situations, is releasing written statements and hiding from questions. In that environment, what does Stephanie White do? If she defends Clark strongly and publicly, she gets accused of demanding special treatment for her star player. If she doesn't defend Clark loudly enough, the fan base that came to the WNBA specifically because of Clark erupts in anger. If she says anything about the officiating, she risks fines and the appearance of making excuses. If she says nothing about the officiating, she's implicitly accepting conditions that she knows are creating unfair game situations. There is literally no winning position available to her. Every direction she turns has a significant cost. And this impossible situation exists entirely because of the leadership vacuum at the top. If Engelbert had established clear, consistent, publicly communicated standards about player safety and officiating accountability, White would have something to reference. She'd be able to say the league has made clear that X is unacceptable, and here's what we're doing about it. She'd have institutional backing for her positions. She'd have a framework for navigating criticism because the framework would have come from above her, not from her own improvised judgment calls under pressure. Instead, White is making it up as she goes. She's making real-time decisions in an environment where the rules of engagement are unclear because nobody above her has bothered to define them clearly. She's having to be Clark's defender, the team's public face, the organization's de facto spokesperson on controversial issues, and a tactically sound basketball coach all at the same time, without any meaningful support from the league office that's supposed to be providing leadership and direction to the entire organization. The criticism that White sometimes faces for being too protective of Clark is particularly unfair in this context. What exactly is she supposed to do when her player gets physically assaulted on the court? Look the other way? Issue a tepid statement about how basketball is a physical game? The fact that defending your player has become a controversial act tells you everything about how distorted this conversation has become. In any other sporting environment, a coach defending her player from what appears to be targeted physical aggression would be celebrated as exactly the kind of competitive fire that leadership requires. But in the current WNBA environment, where everything is filtered through racial tension, competing fan bases, and a media landscape that has very specific narratives to protect, even that basic act of coaching has become charged. And Engelbert's silence means that White has to navigate all of this without a compass, without clear league standards to reference, without institutional support when she makes difficult calls, without any indication from above that the league has her back when she does the right thing. That's what organizational leadership failure actually looks like in practice. It's not just a commissioner avoiding questions at a press conference. It's every person below that commissioner being left to improvise in impossible situations without the support, the standards, or the protection that good leadership is supposed to provide. And Stephanie White is the most visible example of that failure right now, caught in a position where every decision she makes will be criticized by someone, with no help coming from above. Now we get to the part that makes everyone uncomfortable regardless of which side of this debate they're on. Because buried inside all the noise about commissioner accountability and officiating failures is an observation that cuts to the heart of what's really happening in the WNBA right now. And it's an observation that cannot be addressed honestly without talking about race, which is why official leadership has been so completely unwilling to address it. Here's the comparison that needs to be examined directly. Earlier this season, Sophie Cunningham committed what many described as a hard foul on JCS Sheldon. It was physical. It was aggressive. It was the kind of play that gets noticed and generates conversation. What was the response from the new fan base that came to the WNBA largely because of Caitlin Clark? T-shirts. Sophie got T-shirts celebrating her as an enforcer. Her social media following exploded. Fans, many of them new to the league, applauded what she did. They called her a protector. They called her a warrior. They built her into a symbol of the kind of hard-nosed physical play they wanted to celebrate. Then Alyssa Thomas committed a hard foul on Caitlin Clark. One that was genuinely dangerous, that resulted in a suspension, that was worse by most objective measures than what Sophie did. And the response was death threats. Actual threats against Thomas's life. Racial slurs. Calls for her to be permanently banned from the league. The kind of response that crossed from sports commentary into criminal territory. The same type of physical play, treated in completely opposite ways. And the only variable that changed between those two situations was the race of the player committing the foul. Sophie Cunningham is white. Alyssa Thomas is black. That's the uncomfortable truth that nobody in an official capacity wants to address directly. That's the observation that makes this conversation so much bigger than basketball. That's what the analyst means when she says this has nothing to do with basketball. Basketball is just the arena where something much uglier is playing out. Now, it's important to be careful here about what's being claimed and what isn't. The claim isn't that every new fan who celebrated Sophie and criticized Thomas is a racist. The claim is that there's a pattern in how the response to physical play differs based on the race of the player involved. And that pattern has a racial dimension that cannot be honestly ignored. There are people in the newer WNBA fan base who came specifically for one player, and who view every other player either as a supporting character in that player's story, or as an obstacle to be removed. And when those fans respond to physical play, their response is filtered through that lens rather than through any consistent standard about what constitutes acceptable basketball. The danger of this is not just that Alyssa Thomas received death threats, which is serious enough on its own. The danger is what it signals about what the WNBA's new audience actually values. The league's growth has been remarkable and genuine and worth celebrating. More people watching women's basketball is good for everyone in the sport. But if a significant portion of that new audience isn't actually here for women's basketball, if they're here for one specific player, and they view everyone else through a lens that produces racialized responses to physical play, then the league is building its growth on a foundation that could be actively harmful to the players who have been in the league all along. That's the crisis hiding inside the more comfortable conversation about officiating and commissioner accountability. The officiating problems are real and fixable. The commissioner's leadership failures are real and potentially fixable with different leadership. But the underlying demographic and social dynamics that are producing death threats against black players while simultaneously celebrating white players for similar conduct, that's a much deeper problem. That's a problem that no officiating improvement or commissioner press conference will solve. That's a problem that requires honest, sustained, uncomfortable conversation from leadership that doesn't seem capable of having it. And the silence from Engelbert's office on this specific dimension of the crisis is the most telling silence of all. Let's address what the analysts in this conversation kept coming back to. The death threats against Alyssa Thomas. Because this is where the conversation stops being about basketball entirely and starts being about something much more serious. Alyssa Thomas, after a physical play involving Caitlin Clark that resulted in a one-game suspension, began receiving actual death threats. Threats against her life. Criminal communications that in any other context would result in law enforcement involvement and potentially arrest. This is not hyperbole. This is not fan frustration expressing itself through harsh words. This is people using the anonymity of social media to threaten to kill a professional athlete because she committed a foul in a basketball game. Let that sink in for a moment. A basketball player making a hard foul, one that was punished through the league's official disciplinary process, resulted in members of the public threatening to end her life. One of the analysts makes a point that is both simple and devastatingly accurate. If you walk into a Trader Joe's and threaten someone's life, you're going to jail. Death threats are crimes. They're not protected speech. They're not acceptable expressions of fan frustration. They're criminal acts that can be prosecuted under federal and state laws. The people who sent those threats to Alyssa Thomas didn't just violate some vague standard of sportsmanship. They violated the law. And yet the league's response to this was a written statement and silence. No public acknowledgement that what happened to Thomas was a criminal matter. No announcement that the league was cooperating with law enforcement to identify and hold accountable the people who made those threats. No statement of solidarity with Thomas as a human being, as a professional athlete, as a person who had to read messages threatening her life because she played aggressive basketball. Just a piece of paper and radio silence. This matters enormously beyond the Thomas situation specifically. Every other player in the WNBA is watching how the league responds to what happened to Thomas. Every player who has ever committed a hard foul on a high-profile player. Every player who has ever been on the receiving end of intense fan hostility. Every player who is aware of the racial dynamics playing out in the league's fan base. They're all watching. And what they're seeing is that the league office doesn't have their backs. That if they become the target of criminal harassment because of something that happens on the basketball court, they can expect a written statement and nothing more. The practical implications of this are significant. Players shouldn't have to choose between playing hard, physical basketball, and protecting their personal safety. That's a fundamental protection that the league owes every player regardless of who they are, or who they're playing against. When a player can commit a basketball foul, even an aggressive over-the-line one, and then receive threats against their life as a consequence, the league has failed at the most basic level of player protection. What should have happened is clear. The league should have immediately made public statements specifically addressing the criminal nature of death threats. The league should have announced cooperation with law enforcement and encouraged Thomas to file reports. The league should have made it unambiguous that anyone making death threats against players would face consequences that go beyond being blocked on social media. And the commissioner should have been in front of cameras personally delivering that message with the kind of conviction and urgency that the situation demanded. Instead, the situation was handled in a way that suggested it was just another controversy to manage rather than a criminal matter that threatened a player's safety and the entire league's culture. And that handling, or mishandling, sends a message to every player that the league's protection has limits. That if you're on the wrong side of a controversy involving the league's most watched player, you're essentially on your own. That's an organizational failure that goes beyond leadership style or communication strategy. That's a fundamental failure of the duty that a professional sports league owes to every person who plays in it. Take all of the racial dynamics, the commissioner accountability failures, the player safety concerns, and set them aside for a moment. Because underneath all of that is a more fundamental problem that would be creating chaos even in a perfectly harmonious league environment. The officiating is broken. Not slightly inconsistent, not in need of minor adjustments, but systematically, visibly, undeniably broken in ways that everyone involved in the league acknowledges and nobody in a position to fix it has fixed. The evidence comes from an unusual source that makes it impossible to dismiss. It's not just losing teams complaining that the refs cost them games. It's not just frustrated coaches blowing off steam after bad losses. Coaches whose teams are winning are submitting formal complaints about officiating. That's the tell. When you're winning a game and you're still angry enough about how it's being called to formally document your concerns with the league, the problem is real and it's obvious, and it's not a product of competitive frustration. It's a product of a genuinely failing officiating system. The insider perspective on how broken this system is reveals something even more disturbing. Coaches can scratch 2 officials from their games the following season. Think about what that policy actually tells you about the state of officiating in the WNBA. The league implemented that rule because it acknowledges that certain officials consistently perform so poorly, or with such apparent bias, that teams should have the ability to protect themselves from having those officials call their games. That's not a feature of a well-functioning officiating program. That's a bureaucratic accommodation of a known, persistent problem. But the scratching policy doesn't actually solve anything. When a coach scratches a ref, that ref doesn't disappear. They get assigned to other games. They continue calling games for other teams who perhaps don't know to scratch them, or who've already used their 2 scratches. The problem gets redistributed rather than addressed. It's the organizational equivalent of moving water around instead of fixing the leak. The feedback loop failure is equally damning. Coaches submit plays for review. Situations where they believe a call was missed or made incorrectly, and they hear nothing back. No acknowledgement. No explanation of why the call was made the way it was. No communication about whether the review process even happened. Just silence. The same kind of silence that comes from the commissioner's office, except this time it's about specific, concrete, documentable officiating errors rather than broad policy controversies. Compare this to how the NBA handles officiating accountability. The league releases last 2-minute reports that publicly acknowledge which calls were correct, which were incorrect, and which were borderline. It's not a perfect system. Officials still make mistakes and the reports generate their own controversies. But there's transparency. There's documentation. There's a public record that says the league is paying attention to what's happening on the court and is willing to say when something went wrong. That transparency creates accountability. It creates incentive for officials to perform at a higher level because their decisions are being reviewed and documented publicly. The WNBA has 2 built-in breaks coming up that represent genuine opportunities to address this. The All-Star break and the Overseas break when teams travel to Germany. 2 periods where games aren't being played, where the focus can be on internal operations and improvement rather than preparation for the next game. 2 windows where officials could be brought together for intensive review of the most controversial moments from the first half of the season. 2 opportunities to establish clearer guidelines, implement better training, create feedback mechanisms for coaches, and communicate publicly that the league is taking officiating quality seriously. Whether those opportunities get used productively is a question of organizational will. The knowledge of what needs to be done exists. The time to do it is available. The only missing ingredient is leadership that's committed to actually doing it rather than hoping the criticism dies down on its own. And based on what we've seen from the commissioner's office so far, there's genuine reason to wonder whether that will actually exist in a meaningful way. One of the most persistent and most misleading narratives in the WNBA conversation right now is the claim that rules are being specifically created or bent to protect Caitlin Clark. That narrative has taken on a life of its own in certain corners of the media and fan community, and it's creating confusion about what's actually happening on the court versus what's being filtered through layers of political and social commentary. So let's actually break down what's real and what's narrative, because the truth is more complicated and more interesting than either side of this debate usually acknowledges. The freedom of motion rule is real. It exists in the WNBA rulebook. It prohibits defenders from impeding an offensive player's movement using hands, forearms, or body contact that restricts movement. That's the rule. What's important to understand is that this rule isn't new and it wasn't created specifically for Caitlin Clark. It's been part of the rulebook. What changed is enforcement, how consistently and how visibly the rule is being applied. And yes, that timing and enforcement happened to coincide with Clark's rookie season. That overlap has generated the narrative that the rule was created or activated specifically for her. But here's where the narrative gets distorted in ways that don't serve honest conversation. The inconsistency in how the rule gets called is the actual problem, and that inconsistency affects everyone on the court, not just Clark. Sometimes the freedom of motion rule gets called for contacts that are genuinely limiting player movement. Sometimes identical or worse contacts don't get called. Sometimes the same play results in different calls depending on who's involved, who's officiating, what quarter it is, what the score is. That inconsistency is the problem, not the rule itself, and not the idea that Clark is being specifically targeted for favorable treatment. The other side of this is equally important to acknowledge. Clark does specific things on the court that draw fouls. She uses a two-hand push-off to create space, which is an offensive foul, and she's been getting called for it more consistently this season than she was in her rookie year. That's not the refs inventing a rule against her. That's the refs enforcing an existing rule that applies to every offensive player. If anything, that's evidence that Clark isn't getting blanket preferential treatment. She's getting called for things she actually does that are against the rules. The bubble wrap narrative, the idea that people are asking for Clark to be protected from all contact, is a misrepresentation of what the actual request is. Nobody credible is asking for Clark to play in a protective bubble, where she never experiences physical contact. Basketball is a contact sport. Physical play is part of the game. What's being asked for is consistent enforcement of existing rules. When Clark gets hit in the head on a drive, that's a foul. Not because she's special, but because hitting someone in the head on a drive is always a foul. When she gets body checked away from the ball in a way that restricts her movement, that's a freedom of motion violation. Not because she's Caitlin Clark, but because it's a freedom of motion violation regardless of who the offensive player is. The problem is that inconsistency creates the appearance of bias in whichever direction your narrative prefers. If you want to believe Clark is being preferentially protected, you point to the times the freedom of motion rule gets called for her. If you want to believe she's being targeted, you point to the times obvious fouls on her don't get called. Both sets of examples exist because the officiating is genuinely inconsistent for everyone. But the high-profile nature of Clark's presence in the league means that inconsistency gets magnified, scrutinized, and politicized in ways that don't happen for other players. Fixing the officiating fixes this problem. Not completely, not immediately, but meaningfully. When calls are more consistent, when there's less interpretive variability from game to game and ref to ref, the space for competing narratives about preferential treatment shrinks. You can't claim someone is being protected by the refs if the refs are calling the same plays the same way for every player. Consistent officiating is the solution to the narrative problem, as much as it is a solution to the competitive fairness problem. Here's the existential question that everything else in this conversation is actually pointing toward. The WNBA spent 28 years building something specific. It wasn't just a basketball league. It was a league with an identity, with values, with a culture that distinguished it from every other professional sports organization in America. The brand was built on community over individual stardom, on players supporting each other across team lines in ways you don't see in the NBA or NFL, on social justice and activism being built into the DNA of the organization rather than tolerated reluctantly, on the idea that the love of the game and what it represents matters more than individual fame or financial success. That brand worked. It created one of the most loyal fan bases in professional sports, a fan base that stayed through years of half-empty arenas, that bought jerseys and tickets when the league was consistently losing money, that advocated for media coverage when nobody in mainstream sports journalism cared about women's basketball. It created a culture where players genuinely took less money than they could have earned elsewhere, because they believed in what the league represented. It created a pipeline of young girls who saw the WNBA as something aspirational not just because of the basketball, but because of the values it embodied. And then Caitlin Clark happened. Not in a negative sense. Clark herself is not the problem. The problem is what came with her. The explosion of attention and revenue that Clark brought to the WNBA also brought a massive new audience that didn't come for the WNBA's values. They came for Clark specifically. Many of them don't care about the community aspect. Many of them don't care about the social justice history. Many of them don't care about the culture of players supporting each other across team lines. They care about one player, and they view everything else through the lens of whether it benefits or threatens that one player's experience. That new audience represents a genuine crisis for the league's identity. Not because new fans are bad. New fans spending money and watching games is objectively good for the league's financial health. But if the values that built the league over 28 years are incompatible with what a significant portion of the new audience actually wants, then the league has to make a choice. Do you prioritize the new money and the new ratings by accommodating an audience that's driving toxicity? Or do you hold firm to the values that created the foundation, even if it means some of the new audience leaves? Engelbert's approach, based on her actions rather than her words, seems to be to avoid making that choice. To try to have it both ways. To release vague statements about respecting all players while not actually doing anything that would alienate either the longtime fan base or the new one. To keep the money coming in without forcing any uncomfortable confrontations with what that money is bringing with it. The problem with that approach is that it's not sustainable. The cultural tensions that are producing death threats against players, that are creating the impossible position Stephanie White is in, that are driving the double standard between how Sophie Cunningham and Alyssa Thomas were treated by fans. Those tensions don't resolve themselves through strategic avoidance. They escalate. They compound. They spill into places that become increasingly difficult to manage. What the WNBA needed when Clark arrived was a commissioner capable of threading the needle, capable of welcoming new fans and celebrating Clark's extraordinary impact, while also clearly communicating the league's values, and making it unambiguous that those values were non-negotiable. Capable of saying, "We love that you're here, we love what Caitlin Clark has done for this league, and these are the standards we hold our entire community to, fans included, and we will enforce those standards." That message, delivered clearly and consistently from the moment the Clark phenomenon began, would have created a different environment. It would have given the new audience clear expectations. It would have protected the longtime fan base and the existing players from feeling like their league was being taken over by people who don't actually value what the league is. It would have preserved the foundation while building on top of it. That message was never delivered. And the cost of that silence is what we're watching unfold right now. After everything we've laid out, the commissioner's refusal to face questions, the double standard in fan reactions, the death threats against Alyssa Thomas, the broken officiating system, the brand identity crisis, the impossible position of coaches and players operating without guidance from above. The legitimate question is what actually good leadership looks like in this situation. Because the critique matters, but it only matters if it's pointing towards something that could actually be better. First, and most fundamentally, the commissioner needs to be physically present when something this significant happens. Not a written statement. Not a press release. A commissioner getting on a charter flight to Vegas and being visible at that game would have communicated more about organizational values than any statement could. Physical presence says the league takes this seriously. Physical presence says leadership is engaged. Physical presence creates accountability because you can't hide behind a press release when you're standing in the building. The analysts are right. Get on the flight. Be there. Talk to the media. Say difficult things on camera with your face attached to them. Second, the death threats against Alyssa Thomas need to be treated as what they are. Criminal matters. The league should be publicly encouraging Thomas to work with law enforcement. The league should be making it completely clear that threatening a player's life is not a sports controversy. It's a crime that will be pursued through legal channels. That statement, made clearly and publicly by the commissioner, would accomplish two things simultaneously. It would protect Thomas and send a message to the people making threats that there are actual consequences. And it would send a signal to every other player in the league that the organization has their backs when they become targets of criminal behavior. Third, the officiating needs immediate, visible, documented improvement. The upcoming breaks are opportunities that cannot be wasted. Bring officials together. Review the most controversial moments from the first half of the season transparently. Establish clearer guidelines and communicate them publicly. Create a feedback system where coaches get actual responses when they submit plays for review. Implement public last 2-minute reports the way the NBA does, so there's a documented record of what was called correctly and what wasn't. These aren't radical suggestions. They're standard practices in well-run sports organizations. The WNBA should have implemented them years ago, and must implement them now. Fourth, the league needs to have the honest conversation about racial dynamics that its leadership has been avoiding. Not in a way that assigns blanket guilt to new fans, or that dismisses legitimate concerns about Clark's safety, but in a way that clearly articulates that the double standard being applied, where white players get celebrated for physical play that black players get death threats for, is unacceptable, is being noticed, and will be addressed through clear community standards. That conversation is uncomfortable. It's going to generate pushback. But having it is infinitely better than letting the dynamic continue to fester until it produces something even worse than what we've already seen. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, the commissioner needs to build actual relationships with the players. Not PR relationships. Not managed media interactions. Real relationships where players feel like they can pick up the phone when something's wrong and know that someone at the league office actually cares about their answer. That's what Helen means by the ethics piece flowing from the top down. When players trust that leadership is genuinely invested in their well-being, they behave differently. When coaches trust that the league has clear standards they'll actually enforce, they navigate difficult situations with more confidence. The entire organizational culture shifts when the relationship between leadership and the people in the organization is real rather than performative. The WNBA is at an inflection point that will define what the league becomes for the next decade. The decisions being made right now, by Engelbert, by coaches, by players, by fans, by the media covering it all, are shaping an institution that 28 years of players built with their blood, sweat, and tears. Getting this right requires leadership that's willing to be uncomfortable, willing to make choices that might alienate some people in service of protecting the values that make this league worth having. That kind of leadership hasn't been visible, but it's not too late. The question is whether the people responsible for providing it understand what's actually at stake before the window to act closes. The WNBA's current crisis isn't about any single game, or any single incident, or any single player. It's about what happens when an organization grows faster than its leadership can handle, and the people at the top aren't equipped to manage the consequences. Kathy Engelbert standing behind a written statement while refusing to take questions wasn't just bad optics. It was a confession that the league's leadership doesn't have defensible answers to the most important questions being asked about it right now. Those questions deserve real answers. The death threats against Alyssa Thomas deserve actual response, legal and organizational. The double standard in how fans respond to identical physical play from different players deserves honest acknowledgement. The officiating system that everyone agrees is broken deserves urgent, visible, documented improvement. And the 28-year culture of values and community that players built this league on deserves protection from leadership that seems to be hoping the market solves the problem the institution refuses to address. The WNBA has never had more eyes on it than it does right now. Never more money. Never more opportunity. That moment deserves leadership equal to it. What it's getting instead is silence at press conferences and written statements that nobody believes represent real engagement with real problems. That gap between the moment and the leadership meeting it is exactly what this entire conversation has been about. And until it closes, everything else is just managing the symptoms of a deeper failure.